You are holding a sword. The steel is cold, the edge still sharp after 5 centuries. And there is a belief, old, stubborn, impossible to kill, that this blade will not slide back into its scabbard until it has drawn blood, even yours. In 1535, a samurai named Moriyama drew a Muramasa blade and murdered his lord, Kiyoyasu Matsudaira, grandfather of the man who would become the most powerful ruler Japan had ever seen. 30 years later, another Muramasa blade wounded Kiyoyasu's son, and then, in 1579, his grandson, Ieyasu Tokugawa, the first shogun, watched his own son, Nobuyasu, perform seppuku. The blade Nobuyasu used was forged by the same school. 3 generations, 3 wounds, 1 name stamped into the steel. Ieyasu did something no other ruler in Japanese history had done before or since. He banned a dead blacksmith's entire body of work, not because the swords were poorly made, because every Muramasa blade that crossed the Tokugawa bloodline had tasted it. Owning one became a crime punishable by death. But here is what I find most unsettling about these blades, and I have spent longer than I would like staring at metallurgical reports to figure it out. The hamon, the temper line along the edge, follows a pattern called gunome midare. On most Japanese swords, the hamon varies slightly from side to side. On a Muramasa, it is nearly symmetrical, both faces identical. That level of control requires a smith who understood his steel the way a surgeon understands anatomy. And the tang, the nakago, has a distinctive shape the Japanese call tanagobara, meaning fish belly. Tokugawa inspectors learned to recognize that shape by touch alone, in the dark, without unsheathing the weapon. The ban should have ended the story. It did the opposite. For the next 250 years, enemies of the Tokugawa, the rebels called shishi, hunted Muramasa blades with obsessive devotion, believing that any sword cursed against the ruling family was blessed for those who opposed it. They smuggled the blades in false scabbards. They filed off the distinctive Tanagobara tang to disguise the maker, and they killed with them, aiming, whenever possible, for Tokugawa officials. A weapon banned as evil became a weapon worshipped as righteous. The curse did not destroy the blades. It made them immortal. Who decides whether a blade is cursed or sacred? And if the same sword can be both, does the curse live in the metal or in the story people tell about it? That question is older than the Muramasa school. It reaches back through centuries and across oceans. There are objects in museums right now, rings, paintings, chairs, human remains, that rational curators handle with irrational caution. Objects that institutions refuse to sit on, refuse to open, refuse even to move. 10 of them made this list. None of them should frighten anyone. All of them do. The chest sits in a storage room at the Kentucky Historical Society. Nobody keeps anything inside it. Not files, not artifacts, not cleaning supplies. The staff avoids it the way you would avoid a dog that bites strangers. Not out of superstition, but out of habit sharpened by old, uncomfortable stories. The mahogany piece was built around 1830 by a man named Remus. He was enslaved. His owner, Jeremiah Graham, beat him to death for what Graham called poor craftsmanship. What happened next depends on which version you believe. Some accounts say Remus cursed the chest before he died. Others say members of his community performed a ritual over it after his burial. Either way, the Graham family's luck ended the day the chest was finished. Jeremiah's newborn son was the first to die. Then neighbors, who had stored nothing more than hunting clothes in the upper drawer, began dying under circumstances that colonial records describe only as sudden. A servant named Sally attempted a cleansing ritual. She was dead within days. In 1946, a woman named Virginia Cleveland wrote a series of letters cataloging the deaths. Genealogist Beverly Main Kinsler, who would later publish a full monograph on the chest, cross-referenced those letters against birth and death records. 18 names, 18 deaths, not all of them unexplainable, but enough of them strange to give a researcher pause. When the Kentucky Historical Society rediscovered the chest in 2013, staff found the upper drawer still contained owl wings and handwritten notes from an attempted counter-ritual. Nobody removed them. The chest was returned to its corner, and the unofficial rule remains: nothing goes inside. Skeptics will point out that infant mortality in 1830s Kentucky was devastating, that sudden death among manual laborers was common, that a family passing down a ghost story is not the same as documenting a curse. All of that is reasonable. But Kinsel's monograph did something unusual. It verified specific names against county records. Sonny Moore, listed in the 1946 letter, existed. He died young, under circumstances that were, at minimum, statistically inconvenient. Other names checked out too, not all of them, but enough to shift the story from campfire folklore to something that a historian felt compelled to publish. And then there is the matter of the owl wings. They are still in the upper drawer, handwritten ritual notes beside them. Nobody has removed them in nearly 50 years. Think about what that means. A publicly funded institution, archivists, historians, people who work with documents and evidence for a living, has left the contents of a cleansing ritual undisturbed inside a piece of furniture they otherwise refuse to use. That is not policy. That is the absence of anyone willing to make a different decision. The question is not whether a dying man's rage can seep into wood. The question is why a modern institution treats a mahogany chest like a loaded weapon. Fear does not need proof. It only needs a pattern long enough to outlive the people who might have broken it. From a chest that nobody will open, we travel 4,000 miles east to a diamond that nobody could keep. In 1932, a gem dealer named J.W. Paris checked into a Manhattan hotel carrying a 67.5-carat black diamond. The stone was called the Eye of Brahma. According to legend, it had been pried from the forehead of a temple statue in Pondicherry, in southern India, sometime in the 18th century. What happened to Paris is not legend. It is in the New York Times obituary archive. He jumped from a skyscraper. 15 years later, two Russian émigrés, Nadezhda Orlova and Leonila Baryatinsky, both reportedly died the same way, within weeks of each other. Both had possessed the stone. The pattern was specific enough to terrify the next owner into an unusual decision. The diamond was split into 3 separate stones. The logic was almost surgical. Destroy the unity of the object to break the continuity of the curse. As if a gem could be diluted like poison in water. The last documented owner, Dennis Petamasis, told the press in 2004 that the curse was finished. The stone, or rather, the largest of its 3 fragments, had been displayed at the American Museum of Natural History. Nobody had died. Visitors filed past it behind thick glass, admired the strange, opaque surface that absorbs light rather than reflecting it, and moved on to the next exhibit. But here is what nags at me. Skeptics rightly question whether Nadezhda Orlova was truly connected to this particular diamond. Genealogical records from the Russian émigré community in the 1940s are fragmentary at best. The title princess was claimed by hundreds of displaced aristocrats in that era, not all of them honestly. And yet the Paris death is solid. The obituary exists. The jump happened. 1 verified death and 2 disputed ones is not enough to prove a curse. But it is more than enough to explain why every subsequent owner wanted the stone out of their hands as fast as possible. Nobody wants to be the data point that makes the pattern undeniable. From a diamond split to break its power, we climb 12,000 feet into thin alpine air, where another body refused to let go of its secrets. September 1991, 2 German hikers, Helmut and Erika Simon, are crossing the Ötztal Alps on the Italian-Austrian border when they notice something dark protruding from the ice. It looks like garbage, a discarded doll maybe. They are wrong. It is a human body, frozen for 5,300 years. The man they found, later named Otzi, had been murdered. An arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder severed an artery. His body carries 61 tattoos, many located along joints and along the spine, in positions that overlap with traditional acupuncture points. Think about that for a moment. A man who died 300 centuries before the first known Chinese text on acupuncture had lines of carbon ink tattooed onto the exact pressure points that a modern practitioner would recognize. Coincidence is one explanation, but 61 coincidences, clustered in therapeutic locations, is a pattern without a comfortable answer. He was carrying a copper axe, a flint knife, and a quiver of arrows. He had eaten ibex and grain within hours of his death. His fingernails showed 3 distinct stress lines, indicating severe illness in the final 6 months of his life. He was, in every sense, a complete human biography frozen mid-sentence. What came next is what turned Otzi from an archaeological marvel into a case file. Rainer Henn, a forensic pathologist from the University of Innsbruck, who placed the body into a bag with his bare hands, died in a car crash on his way to deliver a lecture about the mummy. Kurt Fritz, the mountaineer who led Hen to the site, died in an avalanche. Helmut Simon, the man who found the body, returned to the Alps in 2004 and froze to death within sight of the spot where he had first seen Ötzi's face. Konrad Spindler, the archaeologist who led the first major study and publicly dismissed the idea of a curse, died of complications from a degenerative illness not long after. 7 people connected to the discovery, 7 dead within 14 years. That is the count that generated headlines. The counter-argument is straightforward and probably correct. Over 150 people worked on the Ötzi project. Most of them are alive and well. Hen died in a car crash. Germany has car crashes every day. Seaman was an elderly hiker in dangerous terrain. The sample is cherry-picked. I believe that is likely true, but I also noticed that no serious researcher has publicly mocked the curse since Spindler. Maybe that is coincidence. Maybe it is something quieter, the kind of caution that does not announce itself, does not write papers, but makes sure to wear gloves when handling 5,000-year-old remains. We leave the ice behind. Where we are going, the air smells of oil paint and old wood. There is a painting in the examination hall of Royal Holloway, University of London. It is large, over 8 feet wide. It depicts 2 polar bears tearing apart the wreckage of a ship. The ship belonged to Sir John Franklin's Arctic expedition, which vanished in 1847. The artist, Edwin Landseer, painted it in 1864 while battling severe depression. Critics at the time said the work carried an unbearable heaviness, as if Landseer had transferred something private and corrosive onto the canvas. The painting is titled, "Man Proposes, God Disposes." It hangs in a room that doubles as an exam hall, a peculiar arrangement that forces students to spend 3 hours under the gaze of polar bears dismantling a mast. The painting is over 8 feet wide. The bear's jaws are open. The rigging tangles around bones. Landseer painted it during a period of such acute mental disturbance that friends feared for his life. He was drinking heavily. He was paranoid. He would die in an institution 7 years later. Whether any of that transferred into the paint is a question for poets, not scientists. But the students who sit beneath it every spring semester have made their own verdict. For over 60 years, the university has covered it with a Union Jack flag every time students sit their exams. The reason is a story that the university cannot confirm and will not deny. Sometime in the 20th century, the exact decade shifts depending on who you ask. A student allegedly wrote on their exam paper, "The bears made me do it," and then took their own life. No archival record of this death has been found. The university says it has searched. Students say it does not matter. What matters is the tradition. Since the 1960s, the flag goes up every exam period without fail. Not because anyone at the administrative level believes a painting can drive someone to madness, but because enough students complained of anxiety, of an inability to concentrate, of the feeling that the bears were watching, that it became cheaper to cover the painting than to argue about it. Personally, I think this is the most revealing case on this entire list, not because I believe the painting is haunted, but because it demonstrates something about cursed objects that no laboratory test can measure. Their power is social. A single unverified story, repeated enough times, becomes a policy. And once the flag goes up, it can never come down, because removing it would be an experiment nobody wants to run. From a painting that watches students, we cross the North Sea to a house that listens. Burton Agnes Hall was built between 1601 and 1610 by the Griffith family in the East Riding of Yorkshire. It is, by English country house standards, modest and handsome. It is also, by any standard, strange. Somewhere inside the walls, sealed behind brick and plaster, there is a human skull. The staff knows roughly where, visitors do not. And the family that has owned the house for over 4 centuries refuses to allow any restoration work near the spot. The skull is said to belong to Anne Griffith, the youngest of 3 sisters who built the hall. In 1620, Anne was attacked by robbers on the road and beaten so severely that she knew she would not survive. On her deathbed, she begged her sisters to remove her head and keep it inside the house she loved. They buried her whole in the garden. That night, according to the family's records, the house began to scream. Doors slammed. Paintings fell. The walls groaned as though the mortar were alive. When the family exhumed the grave, the skull was found separated from the body, dry and hollow, as if it had already decided to leave on its own. They brought it inside. The house went quiet. Every attempt to remove the skull since has reportedly failed. A servant threw it into a passing cart. The horses reared and refused to move until the bone was retrieved. A later owner buried it in the garden again, and the screaming returned. Eventually, someone bricked it into the wall. Problem solved, or at least contained. This is not unique. England has at least 4 other so-called screaming skulls, at Calgarth Hall, Wardley Hall, Bettiscombe Manor, and Chilton Cantello. Each comes with its own legend, its own failed removals, its own ongoing accommodation. It is a peculiarly English phenomenon, the polite coexistence of a rational nation and its irrational architecture. Can a skull scream? Almost certainly not. But in 2020, researchers from the podcast Lore of the Land recorded audio inside the room where the skull is believed to rest. Their equipment registered interference, bursts of static in a pattern they could not attribute to electrical wiring or radio bleed. They published the recordings. They did not offer an explanation. They did not need to. The house had already made its position clear centuries ago. And in Burton Agnes, the test has never been run. The skull stays. The house stays quiet. Whether that is cause and effect, or simply the longest-running superstition in Yorkshire, depends entirely on whether you trust 400 years of silence more than you trust your rational mind. From a skull that demands to stay, we follow a stone that refused to leave. In 1855, during the chaos of the Indian Rebellion, a soldier looted an amethyst from what he claimed was the Temple of Indra in Kanpur. The stone was set in a silver ring, shaped like a coiled serpent, engraved with zodiacal symbols, and stamped with a single letter, T. No record from the temple confirms the theft of this specific stone. No independent document places it in Kanpur before the rebellion. The provenance begins with a claim and a war. The stone passed through several hands before arriving in the possession of Edward Heron Allen, a Victorian polymath, writer, and amateur occultist based in London. Heron Allen became convinced the stone was cursed, not in the vague way that people say a bad day is cursed. In the specific, documented, letter-writing way of a man who genuinely feared for his life. He gave the amethyst away. The friend he gave it to returned it, claiming a streak of personal disasters. Heron Allen then threw the stone into the Regent's Canal. 3 months later, according to his own account, a jeweler appeared at his door holding the amethyst. The man said he had found it in the gizzard of a fish pulled from the same canal. The stone had come back. That story alone is worth the price of admission, and I will confess, it is exactly the kind of thread I cannot stop pulling, even when I know it might unravel into nothing. Heron Allen locked the amethyst inside 7 nested boxes, sealed them, and deposited the package with his bank. He attached a letter instructing that the boxes should not be opened until 33 years after his death. In the letter, he called the stone cursed and stained with blood. He warned any future owner to throw it into the sea. His daughter ignored the instructions and donated the package to the Natural History Museum in 1944. The museum opened the boxes. The stone now sits in a gallery called the Vault. The 7 boxes in the letter are preserved alongside it. Now here is where the story splits. Some researchers believe Heron Allen was genuinely terrified. Others point out that he was also a fiction writer who published a short story called The Purple Sapphire about a cursed gem, and suggest the entire provenance was a literary performance, a hoax dressed as horror. Which version is true? The museum does not say. The letter is real, the boxes are real, the stone sits under glass, catching light. And whether its history is tragedy or theater, it remains one of the few cursed objects accompanied by a handwritten plea from its last private owner. Do not use it. From a stone sealed in 7 boxes, we turn to a canvas that went viral before the word existed. In 1972, an artist named Bill Stoneham painted a portrait of himself as a child. The boy stands in front of a glass door. Behind the glass, dozens of hands press against the surface. Beside him, a doll with hollow eyes stares at nothing. Stoneham based the painting on his own childhood photograph. He said the glass door represented the boundary between the waking world and the world of dreams. The hands were other possibilities, lives unlived, paths not taken. The first gallery owner to exhibit the painting in 1974 died within a year. The art critic from the Los Angeles Times, who reviewed the exhibition, also died within a year. The painting was purchased by actor John Marley. He died too. The painting vanished for decades until it surfaced on eBay in 2000. The sellers, a couple from California, posted a description claiming the figures in the painting moved at night, that the boy sometimes stepped outside the frame, that their 4-year-old daughter refused to enter the room where it hung. They included photographs they said proved the movement, though the images were low resolution and inconclusive. The listing went viral. Over 30,000 people viewed it in a matter of days. Some reported nausea and panic attacks simply from looking at the thumbnail on their screen. A low-resolution image of a painting, compressed to a few hundred pixels, viewed on monitors that could barely render shadow. The painting sold for just over $1,000 to a private collector who has since displayed it without incident. Stoneham responded to the frenzy with something between amusement and resignation. He painted 2 sequels. The hands, he said, were a portal. Not in the mystical sense, in the psychological one. People looked at his painting and saw their own fears pressed against the glass. The boy was him. The doll was memory. The door was the line between what we know and what we feel in the dark. What is more unsettling, a painting that moves in the dark, or 30,000 people who believed it did, based on a grainy photo and a stranger's story? The canvas is oil on board. The fear is something else entirely. From a painting that came alive on the internet, we drive north to a pub in the Yorkshire countryside, where a piece of furniture has been hanging from the ceiling since 1978. The Thirsk Museum is small, quiet, the kind of place where school groups shuffle through on rainy Tuesdays. But in the room dedicated to local history, an oak chair hangs 5 feet off the ground, bolted to the ceiling at an angle that makes sitting impossible. This is deliberate. The museum does not want anyone to sit in it, ever. The chair belonged to Thomas Busby, a counterfeiter and convicted murderer who was hanged in 1702 for bludgeoning his father-in-law, Daniel Audie, to death. The story goes that Busby cursed the chair as he was dragged to the gallows. Anyone who sits in it, he said, will die in agony. For the next 270 years, the chair sat in a pub called the Busby Stoop Inn, named after the very crossroads where Busby was executed. And then, quietly, the deaths started adding up. During the Second World War, pilots from a nearby Royal Air Force base treated the chair as a dare. The pub sat close to an operational airfield. Young men with more courage than life expectancy turned the chair into a ritual, a test of nerve before a sortie, a way of laughing at death before death had its say. According to local accounts collected by the Northern Echo newspaper, those who sat in the Busby chair on the eve of a mission never returned. Not some of them, none of them. The sample is small and the records are oral, but oral records were all anyone had time to keep in 1943. A roofer who accepted the same dare fell from a building shortly after. A cleaning woman who brushed against it developed a brain tumor and died. None of this is peer-reviewed. None of this would survive a statistics seminar. Pilots in wartime die. Roofers fall. People develop tumors. But the pub owner, Tony Earnshaw, did not care about statistical rigor. He cared about the fact that the pattern would not stop. In 1978, he called the Thirsk Museum and asked them to take the chair away. His only condition, nobody sits in it again. The museum agreed. They hung it from the ceiling. Dendrochronological analysis could confirm the wood's age, but the museum has refused all requests to handle the object. It hangs in the hall of Thomas Lord, untouched, 5 feet above the reach of anyone curious enough to test a 300-year-old promise. I will say this, of every object on this list, the Busby chair is the one that makes me most uneasy. Not because I believe the curse, but because a public institution looked at the evidence, anecdotal, flimsy, statistically meaningless evidence, and decided to bolt furniture to the ceiling rather than take the chance. That is not superstition. That is risk management dressed in old clothes. From a chair no one will sit in, we walk through the long galleries of the British Museum in London, past the Rosetta Stone, past the Elgin marbles, into room G62. There, behind glass, stands a painted wooden board roughly 168 centimeters tall. It is the inner lid of a coffin, a mummy board, dating to the 21st dynasty of Egypt, around 950 years before the Common Era. It was donated to the museum in 1889 by a woman named Warwick Hunt. The face painted on the board stares at you with an expression that curators describe as severe. Originally, that severity was not there. Pigment analysis has revealed that the copper-based paints darkened over centuries, gradually transforming a serene face into something closer to a glare. The board has no name inscribed on it. That is unusual. Egyptologists at the museum believe the burial was rushed, possibly during a period of political upheaval in Thebes, when proper funerary rites were a luxury not everyone could afford. Now, the legend. In 1904, a journalist named Bertram Fletcher Robinson published an article claiming the board was cursed. He described a chain of misfortunes among those connected to it. Robinson was 36. He died of typhoid the same year. His death became the proof his article needed. The story spread. By 1921, an occultist named Edward Heron Allen claimed that Madame Blavatsky had once sensed evil emanating from the board. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Heron Allen is the same man who owned the cursed amethyst we examined earlier, the same man who sealed a gem in 7 boxes and wrote a letter begging future owners to throw it into the sea. One man connected to 2 separate cursed objects on this list, spanning different centuries and different continents. The odds of that are either astronomically unlikely or evidence that Victorian London had a very small circle of people obsessed with the supernatural. I suspect the latter, but the coincidence is the kind that makes a researcher's pen slow down. The mummy lid was accumulating mythology the way a ship accumulates barnacles. And then came the most spectacular claim of all, that the board had been aboard the Titanic in 1912, that it had, in some mystical sense, sunk the unsinkable ship. This is where the museum's archives end the conversation. Accession records confirm that the object, catalog number 22542, entered the British Museum in 1889 and did not leave the building until 1990. Not for the Titanic, not for anything. The math is simple. The board was in London the entire time. And yet, the myth persists. Visitors to room G62 report headaches and dizziness more often than in any other gallery. The museum acknowledges this casually, without explanation. Maybe it is the lighting, maybe it is the expectation, maybe it is the face, darkened, unnamed, staring. Here is what this case makes me think, and I admit it has nothing to do with the supernatural. We debunked the Titanic connection. We debunked Heron Allen's claim. We traced the object to a single room for over 100 years. Every thread of the curse unravels under scrutiny, and none of that has mattered. The legend outlived every fact thrown at it, because the face on the board does not care about archives. It only knows how to stare. 10 objects. A blade that drank its owner's blood. A chest that devoured a family. A diamond that drove people off rooftops. A frozen man whose discoverers followed him into death. A painting that watches. A skull that screams. A gem that came back from a canal. A portrait that stepped out of its frame. A chair bolted to a ceiling. And a coffin lid that supposedly sank a ship, and did not need to because the story sank deeper. None of these curses have been proven. Not one would survive a controlled experiment. And yet every single object on this list is treated differently from the artifact next to it, covered with flags, sealed in boxes, hung from ceilings, bricked into walls. The rational world does not believe in curses. It just takes precautions. Which of these 10 objects would you refuse to touch? Not hypothetically. If you were alone in the room, lights low, and someone said it in front of you, which one would make your hand stop? Name it. Defend the feeling. I want to know if the logic holds when the room gets dark. Subscribe. The next case file is already open.